Hello, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to download this podcast from Talk, Mind and Heart. My name is Kevin O'Doxey. I'm a psychologist, I'm an author, and a cognitive behaviour therapist. All of our shows will focus on personal, mental, and spiritual development. Many of the shows that I personally deliver will be on psychological health and well-being from a CBT perspective. My partner Teresa Khan, NLP life coach, Reiki master teacher, and author, we'll be interviewing a variety of teachers, therapists and inspirational speakers over the coming weeks and months. We really want these shows to be as inspiring, informative and relevant as possible to our listeners and subscribers. So please do share with us your thoughts, feelings, opinions and questions. We love to hear from you. Our training and consultancy website is www.calibergold.com and you can get in touch with us from there. And on that website, there are also lots of links to the private practice website of both myself, Kevin O'Doxey, and Teresa Khan, if you want to get in touch with us about therapeutic issues. Okay. And finally, to ensure that you don't miss out on any of our shows, please do subscribe. We're really keen to share this service with a worldwide community. In today's program then, to start off with, I'll be giving a brief overview of cognitive behaviour therapy, talking about when it began, who developed it, how it works, and what you can expect from your visit to a CBT therapist. So, at the moment in the press, you might hear lots of news about CBT and how effective it is for a whole wide range of mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, worry, panic attacks, phobias, etc., etc. There is lots of clinical research evidence to suggest that CBT is actually very effective in many of these issues and more. So let's take a closer look at exactly what CBT is and how it works and what you can expect. So CBT was developed by an American psychiatrist and psychoanalyst called Aaron Beck in the 1960s. Now, Aaron Beck originally trained as a psychiatrist and his main therapeutic strategy was psychoanalysis. After many years of working as a psychoanalyst, Beck began to notice that some of his clients who were depressed had been seeing him for quite a long time and they didn't seem to be improving. Okay. And so what Beck decided to do was to have a closer look at those clients who were experiencing depression and they weren't improving. So he began to record sessions more frequently and he'd play the sessions back to himself and he'd make lots of notes and he'd really kind of analyse those sessions to see exactly what was going on and what factors might be maintaining the depression for these clients. One big thing that he noticed, a similarity with all of those clients who didn't seem to be improving from their depression, was a negative kind of a thinking style, or a negative schemata, as Aaron Beck later termed it. And it was a negative outlook on the world, a negative way of thinking about the world, thinking about themselves, and also negative thinking about the future. And Beck hypothesized that it was this way of thinking about these things that maintained the depressed feelings, and that's why they weren't improving. So what Beck decided to do with some colleagues was to begin to work with those clients and begin to help them to explore those negative thoughts about the world, themselves and the future. And gradually, week by week, he began helping those clients to explore those thoughts and also begin to change them or replace them with perhaps more helpful, constructive and positive ways of thinking about the self, the world and the future. So cognitive therapy was born out of that. So cognitive means anything to do with the mind or to do with thinking. Okay, and later on, behavioural therapy, which has lots of really useful strategies that are used with people with mental health issues, cognitive therapy began to take on board some of those behavioural strategies in the sessions, in the provision of therapy for clients. So the term cognitive therapy later became cognitive behavior therapy. So therapy that helps people to look at the thoughts and the behaviors with a view to changing those. Okay? So it's an interaction of thoughts, feelings and behavior. Okay? Let's look at an example perhaps to clarify the CBT way of looking at psychological distress. Let's imagine that two separate individuals were made redundant, and let's give them the name Paul and Bob. Okay, let's assume that all other things are equal. So Paul and Bob have the same background, they have the same amount of savings in the bank, they have the same amount of monthly outgoings, they have the same sized family, they have the same qualifications and possible future prospects. Okay, so all of the things being equal. Okay, now let's imagine that Bob interprets redundancy as a challenge, an opportunity to perhaps look at something different in life and doing something different to earn a living. Perhaps Bob thinks to himself, okay, well, this is a challenge, it's difficult, yeah. It's going to spur me on to implement some changes in my life. I can handle this. I've been through this before. I've managed more challenging difficulties in the past and came through the other end. Okay. And then Bob goes on to think to himself, okay, what shall I do here? Let me sit down and plan. Let me get some help, advice, support and information from a friend, a colleague, an organisation, a charity, whatever. Who can I get help, support and advice and encouragement from? Let me plan where to access that. Perhaps I can brush up my CV. Perhaps I can make contact with colleagues and ex-colleagues from the past in case they know of any opportunities that might be coming up that I might be suitable for. Perhaps I can look at training and retraining, do something very different. Maybe I can do that. What benefits might I be entitled to? What kind of redundancy package might I be getting? How can I use that redundancy package in the best way that I can? Maybe I can invest, or maybe I can clear some of my mortgage or pay some rent in advance or whatever. Let me look at those options. And perhaps Bob says to himself, okay, I've got all this information here, let me sit down and plan. This is my planning stage. And Bob might want to come up with a planning strategy, okay, a written plan about how he's going to move forward. Okay. Now, Bob's interpretation of redundancy, as you can see, is quite proactive. It seems to be very helpful, constructive, it seems to be realistic, it seems to be achievable, it seems to be helpful overall. Now, the likelihood is that with that kind of interpretation, Bob may still feel some worries and concerns about the future, and that would be natural for him to do so. He's a human being after all. Okay? But he won't feel depressed or anxious or worried. He won't have panic attacks at night time on the basis of that kind of interpretation of redundancy. Okay? Let's think about Paul, who takes a very different slant on his news that he's going to be made redundant. Let's imagine Paul has had similar difficulties in the past as well, but he didn't feel as if he'd coped with them quite as well in the past. Perhaps Paul interpreted redundancy as something very threatening, and he says to himself, typical, nothing ever goes right for me, I'm going to end up on the scrap heap, I'll never get another job, the economy is in dire straits, maybe I'll lose my house, my wife might leave me, my dog might leave me, I might end up on the street with no friends. Okay, very catastrophic, negative interpretations of redundancy. Okay, now you can imagine if Paul interprets redundancy in that kind of way, he's likely to feel very disempowered. He's likely to feel very anxious, very worried, and very depressed as well. and he might not be able to see the wood for the trees, as they say. So, what's going on there? Bob and Paul receive the same information. We've already said that perhaps they have identical backgrounds, but two very different outcomes. Bob's outcome was very different to Paul's outcome. The crucial factor here, from a CBT perspective, is that interpretation. Okay, so the two very different interpretations of redundancy bring about two very different sets of outcomes for those two people. Okay, so the idea of CBT then being that it's not really what happens to us that causes the distress, but rather it's the way that we interpret what happens to us that causes the distress. It's how we visualize, it's how we frame what's going on that causes the distress, or otherwise. So hopefully that was a helpful, and perhaps in the current economic environment, a realistic overview of how CBT begins to help people to understand the link between those thoughts, feelings and behaviours. Let's look at a typical CBT session. So what happens in a CBT session? Well, first of all, CBT is a relatively short-term therapy, so you don't have to go and see the therapist for many, many years. Okay, so typically speaking, although it varies from person to person, typically speaking, CBT would last for between 6 and 12 weekly sessions. Okay, some people will have more than that, perhaps for more complex issues, or they feel they need to work longer in CBT. They could have more sessions than that. But it's certainly not a long-term kind of a therapy. It's not designed in that kind of way. And CBT therapists would often make the point that, you don't need to work for many, many, many years in therapy to achieve helpful outcomes. Okay. So let's imagine you get referred, or you refer yourself to a CBT therapist. In the first and possibly the second session, the therapist will want to gain a very clear understanding of the issue that brings you to therapy. So if you've been experiencing depression, anxiety, panic attacks, for example, the therapist will clearly want to understand when those things happened, when did they begin, how often do they take place, what happens before, what happens afterwards, what kinds of things have you found to be helpful, what kind of things perhaps trigger the anxiety or the depression or whatever it is. And they'll ask a lot of questions like that just to get a very clear understanding of what's going on for you, how it began, how it developed, and crucially, how it's being maintained in the here and now. So that's sessions 1 and 2. And after gathering all that information, the therapist will want to go away between sessions and put together a roadmap, or what we call a case conceptualization. And that basically in CBT is a kind of a map as to what the sessions will need to focus on in order to be most helpful to you. Okay. It's important to say that these first few sessions are very important for the therapist to get that clear understanding, but also for you yourself. These first couple of sessions are very important as well, because they will help you to clarify in your own mind what it is you're feeling, when it takes place, when did it begin, etc., etc. And that can be quite therapeutic for you as well. Okay. Typically in sessions 3 to session 8, the therapist will work with you on some of those thoughts and behaviours that perhaps are not serving you in the way that you'd like them to serve you, and help you to begin to find new ways, more helpful, constructive, compassionate ways of thinking about the world, the future, yourself, your friendships, the work that you do, the place where you live, etc., etc.